We're on Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis, and towards the top of the Amud. And the Gemara had recorded a machlokas here between Rav and Levi regarding the question of Tam versus Reach, in which Rav was of the opinion that we have to reckon with Reach as if it were the Tam of the Guf ha-basar, and therefore, if you have a Korban Pesach of one Chabura together with the Korban Pesach of another Chabura, and they are being roasted together simultaneously in the same oven, or for example, if you have basar shchuta and it's being roasted in the same oven with basar nevela, then in all these cases it's asur. And the reason for that is because ריחא milsa. And Levi says, no, ריחא lav milsa. Now, the Gemara, if you recall, this was the last thing we did yesterday, had quoted a brisa. The brisa says, "Ein solin shnei psachim ki echad mipnei hatarovos." And we thought that what the brisa has in mind here is reach, that the reach is like the tam itself, and it travels from one Korban Pesach into the other. One belongs to Chabura A, the other to Chabura B. And now we have a psul of Shalom Nuyov. And this is a question on Levi and a proof for Ra. So the Gemara reinterprets this brisa. And when the brisa says that we're worried about taroves, it doesn't mean taroves of reach, but rather taroves of gufim. Gufim means the taste that may, in an event that there's negia, there's an actual contact between the two korbanos Pesach, and the tam of one enters into the tam of the other through sleep. And now the Gemara wants to try to prove and adduce a support to this interpretation of the brisa to defend Levi. Hachi nami mistavra. This is where we're going to start today with hachi nami mistavra. So we'll see this approximately, I would say, towards the beginning of the wide lines. Let me just see where we could put our finger here. Hachinami mistabra is the
right next to Tosfos.
Yeah, the Tosfos Dibur Maskil Kam Mashmon, right there, straight across. That's I guess the easiest way you're right of finding. And the Gemara now quotes the Sefer of this brisa. And the Sefer of the brisa says the following: Afilu gdi utle. So it means one Korban Pesach was a kid, we'll call it, and the other was a lamb. And the question is, what is the brisa coming to add over here when it prohibits the simultaneous roasting of two karbanos psachim in the same oven, and one is a lamb and one is a kid? What's the chiddush over here? If you're going to accept the interpretation of this brisa, as we offered to defend Levi, mipnei gufin, that we're worried about a real taroves, we're not allowed to roast simultaneously in the same oven a gedi and a tle. And the chiddush here is that even though it's quite recognizable which is the gedi and which is the tle, they look different. Nevertheless, we still prohibit simultaneous roasting because we're afraid maybe they'll look away, they won't stand with careful surveillance, and they won't distinguish between the two. And then what's going to happen is that there will be a tam of the guf, as we said before, that goes from one to the other. But if we're going to go with Rav's interpretation of this price, that we're talking about reach, what's the chiddush of the seifa of this price? So when it says gedi and tle, mali gdiu tle, mali gdiu gdi, what difference does it make as far as the tzliya and the passing over of the reach from one to the other, whether it's a gdi or a tle, it's two gdis, two tles. In all cases, we have the problem of the reach of one carbon going into the other carbon. So now the Gemara says, well, if you can interpret this brisa like Levi, it now becomes a catch on Ra. Elamai, you have no choice, but based on the sefer, you're going to come to the conclusion al karchach mipnei tarovetz gufen udios. So the reason why we prohibit the simultaneous roasting of two karbonos Pesach must be because the tarovetz gufen. That we're actually afraid that the two karbonos will come in contact with each other. That's what bothers us. Aval tarovetz tamim shari is lemetevi tuv to the Rav. Om Rab Yirmiyah hachmai askina kigon chetzlao b'shtei kderos. The case that the Bryce is addressing is that each one of these two karbonos psachim was being, so to speak, cooked in its own pot. And therefore, in this case, there is no transfer of reach, because reach is only when you have it open on a spit. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, the Torah says that Pesach has to be tzli. And in the case of Kideros, that's not tzli, that's bishul. And the Torah explicitly prohibits you from eating from a korban Pesach that was cooked. Ela ema, but rather what Rav had in mind in interpreting this brisa was ke'ein shtei kederos. It means that although one korban Pesach was on a shipud, the other was also on a shipud, they separated the two, and perhaps they set up a little bit of a mound of coals or ashes or so to separate between the two, and it's like it's shtei kederos, but it's still tzliya. V'hachi kamar, and this is the chiddush of the brisa. Ein solin shnei psachim ki echad mipnei taroves. We're worried about the reach that's going to transfer from one korban pesach to the other, make it into shalol lebailov, shalol lebnuya. And my taroves, and the word taroves doesn't mean taroves of guf, but rather it means taroves of tam. And again, as we said yesterday, the word tam in this sugya means reach. And each one picks up the reach of the other one. And again, it's a case of shalom nuyafafilu ke'ein shtei kederos. And even if there's a separation between the two karbonos, but since they're in the same tanur, the leket harovs tamim, also mishum tarovs gufim, afilu gdi utle. So that even if you circumvent the problem of reach, meaning you guarantee that there is no transfer of reach by setting up a hefsek, a separation between the two. Nevertheless, we still have another chashash, because Rav doesn't deny Levi's principle of taroves gufim, and it could be that the two karbonos will come in contact one with the other, and therefore transfer the tam the way we interpret the word tam, meaning tam guf. And now the brisa understandably adds a chiddush that even if one is a gdi and one is a tle, we're still concerned about the possibility that he won't pay meticulous attention, and there will be a negia between the gdi and the tle, and then we have a problem of psul of shalo lolim nuya. Omar Av Mori Itanoi, perhaps the machlokes between Rav and Levi is an earlier machlokes, and we're going to have to learn a Mishnah in Trumos. And the machlokes that's recorded in the Mishnah in Trumos is a precursor, and it's identical with the machlokes later on between Rav and Levi about Reach. And the Mishnah talks about a case of Harodeh Haschama. Notice he takes out of the oven a fresh and hot piece of bread, a loaf of bread. Unesanan, he places it al pi chavis yain shel truma. So he's got a barrel of truma, and now he takes hot bread and he stretches it over the opening of this barrel of yain shel truma. And now we have a problem. Can this bread be eaten by anyone other than a Kohen? I mean, if you're a Kohen, there's no issue. Now, the Torah says, Kol zar lo yochal kodesh, and the Gemara tells us that the word kodesh here is a reference to Truma, and this is the famous Perek HaOrel in Yevamos, which is dedicated almost exclusively to the laws of Truma. Is Rabbi Meir Oser. Rabbi Meir says that you're not allowed to eat the pas that was placed on top of the chavis shel yayin. It has the status of Truma, and if you're a zar, you can't eat Truma. Now, what's going on over here? There was no tam, the way we use the word tam. There was no tam of yayin that went into the pas. You know, this is not Mishras Anovim in the Pash of Nazir. He didn't soak his bread in a barrel of wine. All you can talk about is the vapor or the reach that comes out of the yayin. And if Rabbi Meir says that it's asur to zarim, he must be basing his isur predicated on ריחא milsa, supporting the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda Mati. Now, right now, the Mishnah records a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. I'm sorry, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, without Rabbi Yossi. And this is a clear-cut machlokes about the status of ریחא. Rabbi Yossi seems to be on the side of Rabbi Meir, and we do have to worry about Reach. However, Rabbi Yossi matir bechitin, shel chitin, v'otzer be shel siorim. Mipnei sha'saorim shavos. Now, the word shavos, which means draw, is a reference here in this context to the Reach. It draws the Reach. In other words, the makeup, the physical chemistry of a pashal siorin is such that it absorbs the smell or the aroma, if we could use a fancy word, aroma of, in this case, yain shel truma. Chitim, if the bread was a wheat bread, then wheat bread is tougher and it will not absorb the reach that's coming up from the yain shel truma. But fundamentally, Rabbi Yossi belongs to the school of Rabbi Meir. It's really Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir ganging up against Rabbi Yehuda. And both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi are concerned about reach, and they recognize that reach is like tam. The only difference is, should we apply that even to a pas shel chitim? That's the machlokas, which is the secondary machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. My love, shouldn't we assume tanoi? The Marsav, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's matir reich lab milsu. Marsav, Rabbi Meir, and for that matter, Rabbi Yossi, both of whom agree that there's an Isur here in the pas, as far as non-Kohanim are concerned. At least they both agree in the case of a pas siorim, is ריחא milsi. Okay, so Rabbi Yossi doesn't apply the principle of ריחא milsa to pas chitim because there is no ריחא milsa. But if there is ריחא milsa, fundamentally, Rabbi Yossi agrees. He's on board with Rabbi Meir, and ריחא has the same status as tam shebeguf, agreeing therefore with Rav Shita. Okay, so far the sugya is pretty clear. Now we get to a little bit of a more complicated logical progression. The Gemara says the following: Levi vadai tanoi. In other words, Levi could in no way be reconciled with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says the pas is osur. Rabbi Yossi says also the pas is osur if it's sa'orim. Both obviously rejected Levi, and they hold ריחא מילתא. The only Tana that Levi could stand upon his shoulders is the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. So there's no question that Levi will have to understand that this machlokas recorded in this brisa, actually in the Mishnah, in Trumos, is about where the ריחא מילתא is. So that Levi has to admit that there's an entire school of Tanoim headed up by Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi that agree that ריחא מילתא, and Levi cannot disagree with that. Levi at best could say, well, I'm going to hold on to the coattails of Rabbi Yehuda. But LeRav, now here's where it gets a little bit more challenging. Nema Tanoihi? Are we compelled to assume that Rav has to agree that there's a machlokas Tanoim about this principle, and Rabbi Yehuda never accepted this principle of ריחא מילתא, so that there is a shita in Tanoim that Rav will have to concede rejects his shita, and that would be the shita of Rabbi Yehuda? No, says the Gemara, Rav could reconcile himself even with Rabbi Yehuda. Amalcha Rav, the Kuli Alma, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that ריחא מילתא. Rabbi Yehuda says the pas is muteres. That's not because reach is not an oser. Reich is an oser, but he holds that a pas that you place on top of a chavis is not boleh reach, even if it's made of siorim, and even if it's a hot loaf of bread that just came right out of the oven, what we call fresh gebak. And now the Gemara is going to try to work very hard to prove that Rav and his principle of ריחא מילתא was accepted universally by all Tanoim, and it's not a subject of a machlokas. Lav itmar lodahi. We have a tradition of Amoraim that interpret that Mishnah in Trumos. Amar Rabba bar Chana Rabbi Shlokish bepas chama vechavis psucha divrei hakol asur. Even Rabbi Yehuda will accept that under certain conditions the pas is prohibited, meaning to a non-Kohen. And what are the conditions that have to be met? Number one, you've got a hot loaf of bread. And number two, you've got a barrel of yayin shel truma psucha. And it's an open barrel. And here, there's clearly reach that will be absorbed by the hot loaf of bread. Again, we're not entering into the question whether or not it's a loaf of barley bread or of wheat bread. On the other hand, if the loaf of bread is cold and the barrel of wine is completely sealed, there's no room for reach to rise up from the yayin and penetrate into the pas. Everybody agrees, even Rabbi Meir in the case of a pas siorim, and even in the case of a pas chitin, everything's mut. Lo nechlaku, says Reish Lakish, what is the subject of the machlokas in this Mishnah Trumos? El v'pas chama v'chavis chasuma v'pas sonenes v'chavis psucha. The question is the gray area in the middle, where you have one of the two conditions but not the other. You either have a hot loaf of bread that was seated down on a closed barrel, or an open barrel and a cold loaf of bread was stretched out on top of the chavis shel yain. So in these two cases, Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that there is a bli of reach. Why? Depending on the case. If it's a case of a paschama, because a hot loaf of bread will draw the reach from the yayin, or because the yayin is open. If the yayin is open, the vapors of the yayin spread throughout. And Rabbi Yossi says that the reach will only penetrate in those two cases if it's a pasior, but not a paschita. V'hanami. Oh, so now we have Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is going to say the following: that in order to have a blia of reach, we need two conditions to be met. You've got to have a paschama and a chavas psucha. But fundamentally, Rabbi Yehuda also embraces the principle of ריחא milsa, if those conditions are met. In the absence of one of those two conditions, either pas is sonenes or the chavis is megufa, it's completely sealed, and you're lacking one of the two conditions, the reach will not penetrate into the pas. Now let's take this and apply it to the case where he roasts two pieces of bread simultaneously in the same oven. I'm sorry, did I say two pieces of bread? I meant to say two pieces of meat. Two pieces of meat in the same oven. One is basa shchuta, the other is basa nevela. And Rav says it's awesome because through the process of tzli, you've got a hot piece of meat that's kosher and a hot piece of meat that's not kosher. And there's nothing sonenes over here. There's no chavis megufa. There's nothing separating the two pieces of meat. In this case, Rav says it's asur, and Rav is going to claim that even Rabbi Yehuda would say it's asur. You have both conditions. You've got two pieces of meat that are both hot, sizzling hot inside the oven as they're roasted. That is parallel to pas chama. And number two, there's nothing separating the two pieces of meat within the oven, and therefore it's like chavis psucha. Hence, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree, hands down, it's a universal or unanimous decision. There's Easter over here. So the thrust of what we're saying is that now that we've put this Mishnah and Trumas in a new light, and the machlokas here where Rabbi Yehuda's matir is only because you're missing one of the conditions, meaning either the meat is cold or alternatively, even if the meat is hot, but the chavis is stuma, then even Rabbi Yehuda in this light accepts the shita of ריחא milsa, and therefore Rav is not entering into a machlokas. Rav is not going to admit that Rabbi Yehuda rejected ריחא milsa. No, according to this interpretation of the Mishnah, even Rabbi Yehuda accepted the principle of ריחא milsa. You can imagine, Rabbosa, we're about to come to the end of the sugya, that the poskim are going to be very machmir about ריחא milsa. But they're going to build a lot on this Gemara about psucha. And it could be that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, and ריחא milsa is only a problem when you have two conditions met. And they are, number one, it's got to be cham, and number two, it's got to be pasua. So they're going to claim, the poskim, that let's say, for example, you have an oven in which you cooked or baked milchiks, and then you want to use the same oven for fleishiks. So they might claim that, okay, everything's cham, but you're missing the second condition of psucha because you close the oven and it's got milchiks in it. Then you put in fleishiks. But what happens if you would use the same oven simultaneously for both milchiks and fleishiks? Now you have both conditions checked off. It's cham and it's pasua. There's no separation between the two. Even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that it's us. If on the other hand it's Bazecher Zeh, that could be equal to Psucha. Some of the poskim say that even Bazecher Zeh, it's not Psucha if the oven is absolutely closed, it's hermetically sealed. And they require a little bit of a window that takes out the air. I think all of our ovens today, I mean, check me out on this, all have some sort of a system which, allows the air to go out. And if that be the case, that might make it into Psucha. But again, you might want to stipulate that it's a Bezecher Zeh situation. He's not using the oven for both milchus and fleshik simultaneously. Now the Gemara continues on the note of ריחא Milsa, Tani Rav Kahana Bereder Rav Chinena Saba. So we now have a brisa that was brought to our attention by Rav Kahana. As she'afa'a im tzli bitanur asur. Now this is very strange. And I'm just using a pedagogical drama here. This is very strange. What are you talking about? You baked a loaf of bread together with meat simultaneously. What's the problem? Is the meat not kosher? The meat is now going to inject its reach into the pas, and now it's as if the pas was bolea, the tam of basa. Now you want to use the pas and dip it into kutach, which is milchix. That you can't do. And this is all predicated on the assumption that ריחא Milsa. Now, I would go a step further here, and I would say that you're not allowed to do this. What do I mean you're not allowed to do this? Not only are you enjoined from dipping this pas into kutach, but I don't think you're allowed to put a loaf of bread, meaning a dough, together with a piece of meat in the same oven to bake the bread, because that makes it into fleshika bread. And the halacha does not allow fleshika bread. Let me just see if he has anything on this. He says that according to Levi, who says ריחא Lav Milsa, you would be allowed to eat this pas together with challah, because ריחא Lav Milsa. Again, we don't accept Levi, but according to Levi. So he quotes here in the note a Rif in Chulin, who says that even Levi agrees that in this case he would not be allowed to eat the pas with milchix, although ריחא Lav Milsa. But l'chatchila, we want to avoid even a case of ריחא Milsa. That's the Rif's take on the shita of Levi. L'chatchila ein litzlos basa shchuta im basa nevela. U'kochen ein litzlos pas, or ein lefos pas yachad im basar. U'lechatchila ein li ochla im challah. That's what he says. I don't know why the Rif insists that that's the case. And Levi, according to the Rif, is moda that the pas should not be used with milchix, but ריחא Lav Milsa is like a b'diavad kind of situation. I don't know, but I'm just wondering. If anybody says what I said, that you're not allowed to do this because it's a fleshika loaf of bread. So far, I don't see anyone saying it. Let me just see. chance in a million he makes a comment on this here. Highly unlikely, but no, no comment, as we say. All right. Ahi binisa. Okay, now we're talking about a fish. This is the whole issue of fish with fleischiks. We have for many of our parents, our fathers, or fathers-in-law, this whole sugi that we're learning was just an excuse to have a schnapps. Anyway, Hahi binisa de itfa bahari bisra. So in one oven, simultaneously, they fried a fish together with meat. There was no contact between the fish and the meat. They were just roasted simultaneously in the same oven. Asra rava mi prazikia lemechal bekusia. You cannot eat the fish with milchiks because ריחא milsa. It means that the reich of the basar is now absorbed into the fish. And Marbar Avashi Omar Afilu b'milcha, even if you want to take this fish and eat it with salt, you're not allowed to do so. He's just using that as a way of conveying that this fish should not be eaten. Nami asura mishum dekasha recha uledavar acher. A davar acher is what we call bacon in our time. He says, kasha l'recha, it's going to affect somehow this fish that has the reach of basar in it is going to have an impact on the odor. And for something else. Something else here probably means tzaras. Let's see if I'm right. 24. He says it causes bad breath. Okay, that's not such a terrible thing, but so davar acher is tzaras. Oh, okay. So it's dangerous to eat fish and meat together. And we'll see this codified in Yeridea in Sima Kufta Zayin. And Marbar of Ashi follows the view of Rav that aroma is a factor, and he therefore rules that even if fish was merely roasted in an oven together with meat, the foods are prohibited on account of danger. Now, I don't know, please correct me if you have access to this information or you could Google it. I don't know that there's any scientific basis for the conclusion that meat and fish together is not healthy. Is there any basis for that in science? I suspect that we're dealing with something metaphysical. Now, again, he points out what we said before, that according to Levi, however, roasting fish with meat, the food is certainly permitted. And as we said before, although the Rif says that even Levi agrees that l'chatchila we avoid ריחא milsa, so we would not eat this fish together with kutach because it was fried, it was roasted together with meat. Now, some explain that since the issue is one of danger, it's all a matter of sakana, it's not a matter of isa v'heta, the food may not be consumed after the fact, even according to Levi. Again, the Rif has a chum in Levi that Levi would agree l'chatchila you shouldn't be doing this kind of thing, but b'diavad you can eat it. Now we're saying that even b'diavad, Levi would say you cannot consume it. And why? Because it's not an issue of isa v'heta, it's an issue of health. And when it comes to health, we have to be very mach. Another proof that I have, I don't know if this is a valid proof, that we're talking in metaphysical terms here with the combination of fish and meat, is that why does the Gemara mention taras? Again, if it's biological, you're going to have to tell me that somehow fish that was fried with meat and so has the time of the ריחא meat is somehow causes leprosy. That's what you're going to tell me. And bad breath, I don't know. But I would say that leprosy itself is metaphysical. For example, there are many dinim that apply to tsaras that make no sense biologically. And therefore, the whole entity of tsaras is some sort of metaphysical sign from Hashem. I mean, this is against the Rambam. The Rambam says that you're not allowed to put coins into your mouth because you might get tsaras. I mean, obviously the Rambam is working with scientific data. You know what I'm saying? It's, we're dealing with not metaphysics, but physics. And there's some sort of contagion here and germs that, according to the Rambam, a mitzvah touched these coins. And now when you put these coins into your mouth, you could contract that disease. But the Ramban doesn't mention this Rambam, but the Ramban is of the opinion over and over again that the entire enterprise of tsaras is metaphysical. It only applies in Eretz Yisrael, and it doesn't apply to a chassan for the first 7 days. And it depends whether the Kohen saw the nega. He didn't see the nega. He declared it as tsaras. He didn't declare it. I mean, this is all, and all the Chazal in Erchin about it's a sign that he has to do tshuva for lashon hara and so forth. That's all metaphysical. But once again, there is something called tsaras. There are lepers in the world, and there is such a pathological, dermatological phenomenon called tsaras. And that's not coming lafuki, a different kind of tsaras, which is metaphysical, which is above the natural cause and effect order of the universe. I just don't know, when we say that fish with meat together could cause tsaras, which category of tsaras are we dealing with? Are we dealing with the metaphysical side from heaven? Probably not. I mean, again, he shouldn't have maybe cooked the meat with the fish and so forth, the same oven, but I wouldn't say that therefore he deserves to be punished with tsaras. And therefore, I think that, we're tempted to classify tsaras in this case as not the tsaras of the Torah, but rather, as I said before, some sort of pathological phenomenon which is called tsaras. But then again, I'm still stuck with my question, why would fish and meat somehow cause tsaras? I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. Unless you want to say nishtanu atvoim, I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase, the teva as the Chazal understood at the time of the Talmud is different than the teva it is today. But as I said before, if you need an excuse for a schnapps after the fish, you've certainly got one here. All right, we're up to the Mishnah now on Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis, and we're going to talk a little about Pesach Sheni. And in Parshas Baloscha, the Torah commands us each ki yeh tamei lenefesh v'yaseh Pesach Hashem b'chodesh hasheni b'arba'asar yom. And this teaches me that a tamei cannot be makriv of the korban Pesach, but we push him off till Pesach Sheni. Now, we had a Gemara. We didn't learn it together, but there's a Gemara back in Talmud Nishchat that darshans the word ish, and it says ish ki yeh tamei lenefesh. Ish nidche v'ein tzibur nidachet. Have you heard of this principle? This is called tuma d'chuya b'tzibur. That means if most of the tzibur of the kahal atmeim, we will bring the korban pesach b'tumah. And not only will we bring the korban pesach b'tumah, we'll even eat the korban pesach b'tumah. I mean, that's unique to korban pesach. It doesn't apply to any other kodshim in the constellation of kodshim. And this din applies to any korban tzibur that's kavua zman, it's time urgent, and it's communal. And if rov hatzibur are tmeim, they will bring the korban. They won't eat the korban because you cannot eat the korban b'tumah. Yeah, I just didn't get a chance. Sorry. Okay. Now, the Mishnah says the following: Chamisha dvarim. There are 5 categories of korbanos tzibur b'Iyun b'tumah. That if rov hatzibur are tmeim, we will bring the korban. Not eat the korban of the basar, as we said, but bring the korban. And Pesach is going to be unique, and therefore it's not listed amongst the 5, because what's common to all these 5 is that Tumah D'chuya B'Tzibur allows us to bring the korban, despite the fact that Rov Hatzibur Tmeim, but not to eat the korban. And here's the list of the 5. Boin B'Tumah V'Einav Nechol B'Tumah. Number 1 is the Omer. Right, that's the Minchas Omer that was brought on the 16th of Nisan, and it was made of barley. And the halacha is that if need be, we will bring the Minchas HaOmer on the 16th of Nisan, even b'tumah. And that will be matir all the new tvua of that, the crop of that year, and make it into yosher. U'shtei lechem, again, we have a korban that's made of, in this case, chita, as opposed to the omer, which is made of siora. And these are 2 lechamim, 2 chalos that they organized on the shulchan, and this took place on Chag HaShavuos. The shtei lechem, which is, I'm sorry, when I said organized on the shulchan, I was skipping ahead of myself to lechem aponim. But as far as shtei lechem is concerned, these are mincha that's brought on Chag HaShavuos, that is matir all the new crops for menachos in the Beis HaMikdash. And then we have lechem aponim. Those are the 12 chalas that are organized on the shulchan on a weekly basis from Shabbos to Shabbos. We have zivchei shalmi tzibur, that refers to Chag HaShavuos again. But on Chag HaShavuos, in addition to the shtei lechem, we have what's called kivsei atzeres, which are a korban shlamim that's brought together with the shtei lechem. U'seirei roshei chadashim. These are what we call seirei izim that are brought on Rosh Chodesh. And these all 5 are nikravim b'tumah, but einam nechalim b'tumah. Pesach, on the other hand, is not on this list. Sheba b'tumah v'nechal b'tumah. If rov hakahal atmeim, not only will be bringing the korban pesach, but we're allowed to eat the korban pesach. And that's based on the very essential definition of korban pesach. What is the essence of korban pesach? Lo ba mitchilaso ela la'achil. The whole agenda, the whole purpose of korban pesach is the ochlas habasar b'layla zeh, as the Torah says, ish lefi ochlo tachusu ala seh, which means a shchita for the sake of lefi ochlo, for eating it. And if the Torah was matir hakravas haPesach, in the case of Tumah, Rov Tzibur, then ipso facto, the Torah must be matir achila, because there is no korban pesach without achila. And that's why we've established that if the Kohen slaughters the korban pesach and he has in mind shalol l'shem ochla, meaning he has in mind for Reuven and Shimon who are cholim or zkedim, and they're not capable of eating the korban pesach, then the korban is possible. The Gemara immediately asks Chamisha l'mutei mai, typical methodology when the Mishnah enumerates all the cases. Why does it have to give a number? I mean, we can count up to 5. Gemara asks the same question about 39 in the case of malachos. Is l'mutei chagigas chamisha sar? There was a korban chagiga that was brought on the 15th of Nisan. And this carbon cannot be brought to Tumah. And we have to understand why Chagiga has a different din than any carbon tzibur. The Salka Dait Chamina, I would have said that all the conditions to activate the principle of Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur are existing in the case of Chagiga. Number one, Kevon de Karman Tzibur, the heter of Tumah is Dafka B'Tzibur, but Chagiga is in fact a Karman Tzibur. Number two, Bi'alamoed. There's a time urgency. The Karma Chagiga is relevant or related to a specific time, namely the 15th of Nisan. So we have all the conditions that we need, and therefore Tidche Tumah. We should apply the principle of Tumah D'chuya B'Tzibur, and we should bring even a Chagiga B'Tumah. Kamash Malan, so the Tana Mishnah wants to teach us, no. This carbon is not Docha Tumah. Now, Baruch Hashem, I'm very excited that the Gemara gives us some clue as to why Chagiga is different than any other carbon tzibur. And it's not Docha Tumah. I mean, after all, it's a carbon tzibur. It's got a moed. There's a time element involved. And the moed generates the chiyuv of Chagiga. So why do you tell me that Shtei Alechem or Minchas Omer and all the Zivchei Shalmi Tzibur of Shvuos, all above a Tumah? But not Chagiga. So the Gemara answers, Kevon de Islay Tashlumin Kol Shiva Lo Dachya Shabbos. Now, we're not talking about Shabbos here in this Mishnah. The Mishnah actually in the previous parak, actually 2 prakim ago, deals with Shabbos. It had to be Docha Shabbos for the sake of the Korban Pesach. But somehow, the Gemara is operating with an analogy between Shabbos and Tumah as to whether or not the carbon is Docha Tumah, and that will depend upon whether it would be Docha Shabbos. Now, in the case of Chagiga, the carbon is not Docha Shabbos, which means that in event that the 15th of Nisan coincided with Shabbos, we will not bring the carbon Chagiga. Again, we don't know why, but that's what it says. Umi the Shabbos lo dachya tuma. If the carbon Chagiga is different than, let's say, for example, a carbon Pesach, which is Docha Shabbos, or any time urgent carbon on behalf of the tzibur is Docha Shabbos, why shouldn't Chagiga be Docha Shabbos? But apparently Chagiga has its own dinah. And if it doesn't have the power to override the Shabbos, then it won't override Tumah. So even if Rov Tzibur Atmeim, you will not bring the Karma Chagiga. Now here he has a note, and he says that it says V'chagosem oso chag l'Hashem shivas yomim b'shana. Now, how do you see in that pasuk that it's not Docha Shabbos? And the answer must be because it's lacking a key element in the equation that allows you to be Docha Shabbos, and that's Moed, meaning it's got a specific zman kavua. It has to be brought on Shabbos. If you don't bring it on Shabbos, the korban is lost. That's not so in the case of Chagiga, because the Chagiga, even if the 15th is on Shabbos, has tashlumin. So if it doesn't have zman kavua, then we're not going to override the Shabbos. He says, Tam echad yesh l'dchias Shabbos l'dchias Tumah. Why does the Gemara assume an analogy and lowers the level of Chagiga because it has Tashlumin? It's not Docha Shabbos, and therefore ipso facto it's not Docha Tumah. And that is Kvius Zman. The Torah has revealed to us that Chagiga is not a korban that's Kavul Zman, and therefore it's not Docha Shabbos. It has Tashlumin. There's no urgency to bring the Chagiga and violate the Shabbos. Kein adin afle inyan d'chias hatumah. That d'chias hatumah is because right now we have an urgency to bring the korban. It's got a zman kavua, and we have no tmei. We have no tahorim. We're all tmei. Everybody's had it already. So he says, therefore, it's not Docha Tumah for the same reason that it's not Docha Shabbos, namely because it's not Zman Kavur. You could be Docha. So to the same extent, you could be Docha till after Shabbos, and therefore it's not over. It doesn't override the Shabbos. So too, it doesn't override Tumah because you know what? Let's wait till we find Tahorim. There's no urgency. So the Gemara asks, "V'nisnei nami seirei haragolim hatani le zivchei shalmei tzibur." Now, what does the Gemara mean here by seirei regolim? You get the impression that we're talking about zivchei shalmei tzibur, karbanos of the tzibur on the regolim. What does it mean, the regolim? Seirei chatos hakrevim b'shloshes haregolim sheboim b'tumah v'einam ne'cholim b'tumah. So the seirim called seirei chatos that are brought on the sholosh regolim, they all have a zman kavua, and therefore they should be listed here as number 6 on the list of that which is doche tumah v'eino nechal b'tumah. Okay. Now, if we want to find the seirim, the seirei chatos of the sholosh regolim, where do we find it? So that's actually in Parshas Pinchas. So why wasn't seirei regolim mentioned in our list of the Mishnah, the 5? It should be number 6. Hatani late, it really is there. Where is it? It's zivchei shalmei tzibur. Now we said zivchei shalmei tzibur were the kvasim that were brought on Shavuos together with the Shtei Alechem. But now the Gemara seems to be expanding what the Mishnah says, Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, to include all karbanos that are obligatory on the Tzibur and have a time urgency to them, and yet you cannot eat it to Tumah. So this Bli Neder will have to pick up tomorrow, actually Yom Rishon, right? Today is Yom Chamishi. It's hard to believe that the week has passed. So let's just make a note of where we got to it. So we're on the bottom now of Ayin Vav Hamid Beis, Ha Tanile. If it's Hashem, I want to wish you all a great Shabbos, Parshas Bo, and we'll pick this up on Yom Rishon.